Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. So in this episode, I'm going to tell you about my experience of working in prison. I'm going to tell you about what I was and wasn't expecting, what it feels like going into prison, whether it's scary, and I'm also going to tell you a bit about how deliberate self-harm is addressed in prison. On top of all of those things, I'm going to outline a real-life case of a man called Mr. S, who I assessed. He was labelled as a snitch in prison, he was badly beaten, and he developed psychiatric illnesses. This is part 3 of a 4-part series. On my previous episodes, I've answered questions such as, why is mental illness so prevalent in prison? I've talked about both the obvious and the more subtle connections and reasons. And I've also talked about the tragic suicide of a young lady named Sarah Reed, who is a 31-year-old mixed race woman who took her life in prison. And I talked about some of the factors that might have contributed to that. I've also talked on my previous episodes about the pros and cons of working in prison. So that was about the actual role of a prison psychiatrist. I'm going to tell you about one of my real life cases. So this is probably one of the most interesting psychiatric cases that I've seen in prison. As always, I've anonymized the individual, I've changed some demographic details to make him less identifiable out of respect of patient confidentiality. Mr. S, he was a prisoner in Nottinghamshire, and I assessed him for a civil court case, not a criminal one. So what I mean by this is he'd already gone through his trial many years earlier. He was already doing a 25-year bid for killing a man when the two rival football hooligan firms clashed, and he was already 15 years into that 25-year sentence. I was seeing him for a clinical negligence case. So this man, Mr. S, was suing the prison estate for not keeping him safe because he was seriously assaulted. So my job was to look at the psychiatric consequences of these assaults. So let me tell you about Mr. S. He was a thin, bald Scouse man, and what had happened was that a gang of youths on his prison landing were peddling spice to other prisoners, and they were demanding extortionate payment for this drug. And if people couldn't pay them, they would beat them up really badly. And apparently they even shattered somebody's eye socket, and they burnt somebody else's hand intentionally with boiling water. So Mr. S had seen this, he'd had enough, so he felt compelled to intervene. He felt sorry for the victims. So he informed a rabbi, and they had this secret intel meeting or a debrief meeting. So he told the rabbi about these guys' operation. And what happened is that immediately afterwards, the rabbi was talking to a prison officer, and they were going through some of the details of this conversation. And another prisoner overheard them. So this prisoner immediately told everybody else, and Mr. S was labelled a snitch. And as we all know from common prison parlance, snitches get stitches and potentially can end up in ditches. So Mr. S tragically went through this campaign of hate. He was punched on at least 6 or 7 separate occasions. Staff tried to keep him safe. He was locked in a cell for his own protection, but he had urine, feces, boiling water, all of this was squirted through the little hatch of his cell. He even had feces put in his food, shepherd's pie by the way, which I suppose kind of makes sense. To the point that to stop this happening, he had to eat only pre-packaged food. And he even moved prisons a couple of times, and he was even placed on the vulnerable prison units for his own safety, which is usually for sex offenders. But unsurprisingly, his label followed him around. So even though he'd be safe for a few months, eventually it would catch up with him. Eventually another gang or another thug associated with the first gang would beat him up. So when I saw him, he was a wreck. I diagnosed him psychiatrically with adjustment disorder and specific phobia related to being assaulted. So an adjustment disorder is like an emotional or behavioural reaction to a really stressful life event or circumstance. So somebody could be a victim of an assault or a rape, or they could have, for example, witnessed a murder, could be a death of a relative. The person's reaction is considered to be unhealthy or an excessive response to the event. So we're not just talking about normal reactions or normal shock or normal grieving. This is more than this. And by definition, an adjustment disorder has to happen within 3 months of the situation. And sometimes it can be temporary, so they get over it, and sometimes it progresses to another disorder. Obvious ones would be depression or PTSD. And just to educate you a little bit psychiatrically, PTSD tends to be from one event. You can have a series of events that's complex PTSD, but that's a whole other video. Whereas adjustment adjustment disorder, it's not just an event, it can be from a situation. So for example, you go into a new job and you're being relentlessly bullied. So phobia, I'm sure you've heard of the term phobia, and it's like a lot of things in psychiatry, it's often misused to mean somebody just being a bit scared of something. But a specific formal phobia is more than that. So this refers to a group of anxiety symptoms brought on by certain objects or situations. It's usually a lasting and unreasonable fear, and it's caused by either the presence or the thought of a specific object or a situation that often, although not in this case, usually poses little threat or actual danger. And the distress associated with the phobia leads to the sufferer avoiding that particular object, and it can significantly interfere with the person's ability to function. Adults with a specific phobia, they recognize that the fear is excessive and unreasonable, yet despite this, they're unable to overcome it. A common one would be a fear of flying, and it has to be an unreasonable fear. That's the important bit. So it's not just being a bit nervous before a flight. That's not phobia, that's not pathological, and it's not a disorder. But if you were extremely agitated before every flight, say to the degree that you needed a sedative, maybe you've avoided flying at times, or you become preoccupied with the flight for a day or two before it happens, that's more likely to be a phobia. As another example, unless you have a specific phobia of pressing buttons, there's just no acceptable reason that you've not subscribed to my YouTube channel yet. You're being rude, sort it out. So Mr. S was not just in fear of being beaten up like you or I might be, or I don't know, maybe you like to throw hands, I don't know. But he had obsessions and ruminations about this constantly. It had an immense effect on his daily functioning. He had a flare-up of his really bad eczema. He could barely sleep, barely eat, and he was just constantly terrified to the point that he couldn't function. He was constantly looking out of his cell hatch and looking out of his cell window. So Mr. S was still kept in prison. He still had to serve his sentence, but my evidence helped advance his court case, which would have added to the compensation that he got. What I'm about to talk to you about now is slightly different, because I'll be talking about what it actually feels like, the experience of the job itself, particularly the aspects I wasn't expecting. So firstly, it's not actually that scary. You kind of get used to it. I think initially I found it quite intimidating. There were locked gates, or the security, you had to carry keys to go through, there's big wire fences around the place. You get stares from a lot of the inmates, especially if you were new. But I've been so many times now. When I worked in a women's prison, I would go there twice a week to run clinics for around 2 years. In terms of medico-legal assessments in prisons, I must have seen several hundreds of those. So personally, after around the third or fourth time, I got very used to it. It was no longer scary. In terms of my other experiences, I'd probably compare it a little bit to stand-up. So I've tried some stand-up comedy. I have dabbled, and initially that is terrifying, but you soon get used to it. In fact, I'd say that stand-up is more scary because it took me about a dozen shows before the anxiety levels started decreasing, whereas prison only about 3 visits. As I've said before, there's not actually that much aggression or violence in prison from my perspective. I talked about this in the last episode. It does occur, but it doesn't occur as often in the places where I worked. Occasionally you see people kicking off, but people in prison who are already dangerous are usually already separated from their peers, either in segregation or in the healthcare unit. I'd also like to say that I've seen many inmates who are very polite, very friendly. I've had lots of nice conversations, and I've enjoyed their company at times. The other aspect about working as a prison psychiatrist is there's a lot of waiting around and sitting. I've already mentioned that as a medico-legal visitor, you have to wait on your way in. You have to go through all the security. But even as a regular member of staff, even though there's less waiting going in and out, there's still a lot. On top of all that, the prison would occasionally go into lockdown. So if there was some sort of incident, even if it was elsewhere in the prison, some sort of fight, you'd hear this alarm and all the doors would be electronically locked, even if you had a key, which means you can't move around the prison. This is to stop cases of violence spreading through the prison, to stop riots, or to stop somebody trying to escape. Sometimes it can be very frustrating, as before that I was going along my day and now I'm stuck in a clinic room and I can't get to my main office in another building in the prison to write up my notes, which is annoying because I'm very pressurized for time and I can't do it, or vice versa. Sometimes I've done my paperwork, I've prepared to see the patients in clinic, but I can't physically get to the clinic because I'm stuck in the office because of lockdown. Usually lockdown lasts roughly around half an hour to 45 minutes. I suppose it depends on how long it takes for the prison guards to quash whatever drama. The longest lockdown that I've personally experienced was about 3 hours. Another interesting, unexpected aspects of working in a prison is the guards' attitudes. So like most scopes of life, there were some very good prison guards, but I also saw some that made me feel uncomfortable with their attitudes. Generally, I would say the ones that were working in the healthcare unit had an understanding that the prisoners there were mentally unwell, and they were actually quite caring, they were kind, and they were professional. I'd say it's probably in their nature because that's why they volunteered to work in the healthcare unit, although possibly, potentially over time, because they sat in on our clinical meetings, they could hear the patients being discussed with the doctors and nurses. They might have seen some patients improve in their presentations, in their violence, in their attitudes with treatment. So I think this whole experience increased the empathy of some prison guards working in the healthcare unit, and it helped them gain an understanding of mental illness. However, some guards had a bad attitude towards all prisoners. Some guards were judgmental, even to prisoners that had mental illness. I've seen guards laughing about prisoners who are psychotic, or they don't seem to understand the very concept that these people need to be treated. I've heard guards use derogatory terms such as spaz or wrongen, and I've seen guards who seem to want all prisoners to be punished if they're agitated or paranoid or acting out the prisoners. These guards struggle with the concept that they might be mentally unwell, that they could change with treatment, and they only want to send these prisoners to the segregation unit, not medicate them, not help them. I'd say this is different from nurses that I've worked with in hospitals. Like all professions, there are some very good ones and some are not that good. But generally speaking, nurses that I work with have some degree of compassion. If you're more interested in knowing what the roles of different people, including nurses, are, go check out my video about life on a psych ward. So personally, I found it really hard. I couldn't excuse officers who mistreated prisoners or made jokes about mental illness. You know me, I'm all about decreasing the stigma of mental illness. That's part of the reason I made this channel, although let's face it, also slightly to do with my own narcissism. However, despite everything I've said about prison guards, I have to acknowledge that it's a very hard job. It does kind of attract some meatheads who want a bit of a brawl, the kind of people that if you bumped into them in a pub and you spilt their pint, they'll be having words and you'll be buying them another drink. In some prisons, the guards are constantly aggravated. Sometimes they're even threatened. Sometimes they're even worried about their own life, and they're not paid particularly well. So I don't envy the circumstances and the situations that prison guards find themselves in. Another aspect of working in a prison that was unexpected for me is not having keys. So vetting the people to work in a prison and also getting them keys assigned each take months. So even after they've been vetted, even after they've been working in the prison, it still can take months for them to get their own keys. I'm not sure why. When I worked at HMP Pentonville for the detox wing many years ago, I worked there for 4 months and I was never given keys. I had to wait at the prison gates every morning for a nurse or a member of the admin team who had keys to come and get me. Then they had to escort me around the prison for the whole day. They would unlock the clinic room, I would go in. The rest of my movement, if they weren't around, which was quite frequent, I would have to shout. So I'd literally have to get to the locked gate and yell, can somebody let me out? Even when I wanted to use the toilet. I should tell you, there was a sink in my office. I was very tempted, but I never did it. Or maybe I did. Maybe I'm lying to you guys now. You'll never know. Okay, now I'm going to give you an overview of deliberate self-harm in prison. So around 5 to 6% of men and 20 to 24% of women self-harm in prison, whereas only about 1% of adults in the general community self-harm. So in prison, the influences and the factors include specific psychiatric diagnoses such as depression, borderline personality disorder, and also prison-specific environmental factors such as solitary confinement, being the victim of sexual or physical abuse. In prisons, we have like a system, a safeguard. It's known as an ACT, an ACCT, which stands for Assessment, Care in Custody and Teamwork. So if somebody's on an ACT, it means they're at risk of self-harming. They have frequent one-to-one sessions with officers. They have a heightened level of observation. They have regular multidisciplinary team meetings, which means they're seen regularly by prison staff, by nurses, by psychiatrists. And also they have this little ACT book that follows them around. So if they go to the gym or if they go to therapy sessions or arts and crafts, this book follows them around, and the prison guards document what their mental state's been like so that somebody can review it to see how they're doing in general. And if people are deemed to be very high risk, then they might be moved to the healthcare unit, which I've talked about in some of my other videos. It's like a closed off quieter, calmer section of the prison. It's a bit like a psychiatric ward in a prison. There's more observation, there are visiting doctors, and there's nurses there every day. On a side note, I think it's important to inform you guys that the vast majority of cases of self-harm is dealt with in the prison rather than a psychiatric hospital. And part of that reason is because it's very easy for prisoners to manipulate and threaten suicide and even actually hurt themselves if they want to be transferred. And that's certainly something I've personally seen many times. If you've seen episode 1, you'll know that I talked about the tragic suicide of Sarah Reed, which kind of proves that even with the Act, even with all these systems in place, they're not fully effective. Just quickly before I do that, I'm going to formally introduce you to this channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess defendants and rehabilitate them in courts, in prisons, in secure psychiatric wards. This channel has a whole range of videos about mental health topics, some to do with violence and offending, and some absolutely unrelated to that. I interview ex-patients, I've interviewed a policeman who developed PTSD, I talk about high-profile true crime cases if there's an element of mental illness involved. I talk about individual diagnoses. I've got a lot of stuff and you're going to enjoy at least some of it. There's something for everybody on this channel. Go check it out and subscribe, please. Don't be difficult. So to conclude my video, hopefully I've given you an understanding of what it's like to work as a psychiatrist in prison. Hopefully you found the case of Mr. S as intriguing as I did. I genuinely felt sorry for the guy, plus it's put me off shepherd's pie for life. Now, I think it's fair to say that Mr. S obviously had done something majorly wrong. Killing is never cool, kids. But he was already paying for his offence with a long prison sentence. He appeared to be at least on the road to rehabilitation. He was a model prisoner. There were no violence. He never used drugs. And I think he was actually genuinely looking out for the other prisoners who he thought were being beaten up and being targeted. I guess that just goes to show that life of a prisoner is hard. I've watched other YouTube videos of people that have been to prison, as I'm sure many of you have, and one piece of advice that's always given is to mind your own business, never get involved in other people's problems. And I think Mr. S's case is proof of this. He was labelled as a snitch and it was very difficult to shake that off. Okay, so I hope you'd enjoyed this episode, my 4th and final one in the series. Next episode, I'll be talking about spice. Not sure if you've heard of spice. It's a nasty synthetic cannabinoid, also known as a novel psychoactive substance. It can make people extremely agitated, it can make them paranoid, it can even make them psychotic. And I'll tell you about another real life case. So this is a Brazilian woman who I assessed in prison. I thought she was psychotic, but it was really hard to prove because she just refused to speak to me. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it makes you float like a butterfly and sting like a bee, guaranteed. I'd be very interested to hear about your thoughts and experiences, especially if you've been to prison or you know somebody that went to prison. Tell me about what it was like. Tell me about the psychiatric illnesses that you saw there and whether the treatment was any good. Also, I'd like to know if any of you have any phobias about anything specific. Let me know in the comments below. Tell me specifically how it affects your life. As usual, you can hit me up on the usual social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc, etc. Please tell your favourite people about A Psych for Sore Minds. They deserve it. Spread the love. Before I leave, I'd like to let you know something. If you're a regular viewer, you will already know that I'm going to be a speaker at CrimeCon UK, which is a massive true crime convention. It's going to happen in London for the first time ever in the UK in September. You're going to hear about serial killers, unsolved crimes. You're going to hear from criminologists, law enforcement, your favourite podcasters. I'm going to be doing a talk. I'm going to be talking about 2 real life cases of people that have killed their own family members, one who was mentally ill, one who wasn't. If you are a true crime enthusiast, you cannot miss out on this event. Use the link in the descriptions below to get your ticket. Use the code PSYCH for 10% off. Until next time, stay euthymic and please remember,